Hey everybody, we have 3 new courses coming up at Renegade University. First, we have Aristotle, part of the Great Books webinar series taught by me. That's in March. Also, Blaxploitation with Kamasi Hill and me, studying the famous films of the 1970s that changed American popular culture and race relations in this country forever. And then we have Introduction to Virtual Reality and the Metaverse, taught by the great Tom Nickel. So, go to renegadeuniversity.com/courses for more information and to enroll in these wonderful webinars coming up soon in March. I'll see you in class. This is the Unregistered podcast, and I'm Thaddeus Russell. This is a show about ideas, people, and behaviors that are considered inappropriate, out of bounds, or beyond the pale. The things you're not supposed to talk about if you're a school teacher, a college professor, a businessman, a politician, a parent, a neighbor, or even a podcast host. These are the things you're not supposed to say or even think if you're a good liberal, a good conservative, or a good citizen. Each week, I'll interview a person who has something bad to say. They might be a journalist or a professor. They might be a porn star or a drug dealer. They might just be an ordinary person with an ordinary job who doesn't care about the rules of polite society. I'm not interested in breaking the rules just to be a troublemaker. I'm interested in people who break the rules of conventional thought and to expand the scope of what is possible to say in our society. I'm interested in people who make me think. We've heard a lot lately about the World Economic Forum, led by Klaus Schwab, that meets in Davos annually. But is it a cabal of globalists who have a plan to control us all? Or is it just a group of capitalists interested in protecting their profits? I asked the person who just wrote the book on this very subject. This is my interview with Peter Goodman. I am joined from one of my favorite places in the United States, the Hudson Valley, by Peter Goodman, who has written a book called Davos Man about, now, Peter, I think people initially would say this is a book about the World Economic Forum and, the meeting in Davos after which it's named, et cetera. But am I right? Is this fair to say that your book is really more about, or primarily about, the people who are part of the World Economic Forum, in particular, the most important people in it?
Yeah, I would say it's really broader than that. It's about the billionaire class and how they have essentially engineered this bottom-up transfer of wealth over decades, and they've totally warped our democracies. And then the forum and Davos itself comes in as a way to understand the charade that's at the center of it all. Mm-hmm. But it's really not a book about the forum. There's lots of titillating, gossip about the forum. It's about the billionaires who've pulled the levers of democracy for their own benefit while claiming that they're doing it all for us.
Right. Yeah. So for you, it's all a front or a charade, as you said. They don't really believe a lot of the stuff they're saying about progress and justice and equity and all the things that they talk about, right? It's really a front, basically, to show people that they're good people when they're really just interested in enriching themselves further.
Well, I think part of their gift, actually, is that they do seem to believe it. Who knows what anybody believes, right?
Yeah.
I think, having observed Davos Man in his natural habitat for many years, I think one of the great skills of the billionaire class is that they can begin with this outcome, then they can construct this narrative, and then the narrative becomes truth. And so the key truth is we're the good guys. And if we're the good guys, then the more powerful we are, the more good we can do. And the more money we have, the more powerful we are. And so that then justifies, years of engineering tax cuts, defenestrating antitrust enforcement, diminishing the power of labor, because it's all about boosting the prowess of their own companies. And now they come up with this handy term that I run down in the book, stakeholder capitalism, this idea that, companies are no longer governed by Milton Friedmanism. It's not just about maximizing profit and returning it to the shareholder. Companies are now organized to cater to stakeholders like labor, not labor unions. They're never part of the conversation, but certainly labor, local communities, the environment. And so they're inviting us to participate in this idea that the billionaires can be entrusted to solve all of our problems. And given that, it's better for the billionaires to have more resources.
Okay. So I want to tell you sort of where I'm coming from on this. I've had two people, I think, on my show who, so you work for the New York Times. People may not know that. So who people in the New York Times world would definitely consider to be conspiracy theorists, who argue that Davos World Economic Forum is part of a coordinated transnational network of elites, government and business, who have been attempting to impose a new system of world governance that involves tremendous amount of surveillance and intense regulations in the name of climate change that will actually reshape the economy fundamentally, and in which business and government are collaborating in this new sort of governance system. I'm sort of agnostic on this. I'm not sure I care. I'm not sure if I should care. Your book takes a very different tack in which you argue, as we've been saying, that they don't really believe the stuff that they're saying. And therefore, are you arguing that they're not interested in imposing a new world order on us?
I have no truck for conspiracy theories. I'm a fact pattern person. I report what I know. Conspiracy theories, they're interesting, but they're conspiracy theories. And I think what I'm writing about is much more pernicious than a kind of comic book version of life as distilled into conspiracy theory. This is all happening in public view. We can see over the last half century in major economies, more and more money has entered politics. It's gotten more and more sophisticated. It can use social media to help misinform and manipulate public opinion. And the result is governments that right out in public have bought into what I call the cosmic lie. this idea that if you just organize societies to deliver more wealth to the people who have most of it, the magic is supposed to just trickle down through everyone else, something that in real life has happened 0 times. And we can see what's happened through this kind of open air experiment in the magic of trickle down. Workers have gotten less and less. They've gotten less and less of the share of productivity gains. So they're not getting their fair piece of the returns of capitalism. And we've seen monopoly power growing. And we've seen deep cynicism and dysfunction and underemployment in lots of communities. I think this is much bigger than you could account for through some, idea that there's some secret club where everybody meets. I don't think Davos is some secret club. I do think that it does play a role in terms of helping this process for the billionaire class. Davos is this kind of public-facing, earnest meeting of academics and non-governmental organizations and the odd billionaire heads of state meeting at these seminars where they're discussing climate change and the future of work and racial injustice and gender inequality. But the real Davos, the one that I'm most interested in, is actually in secret. It's a series of meetings that take place in these lounges that members can only get access to if they pay hundreds of thousands of dollars a year for their memberships. And then Klaus Schwab, who's the ringleader of Davos, the founder of the organization, will kind of play matchmaker between members of the Saudi monarchy and CEOs of fossil fuel companies. It's like the ultimate lobbying opportunity, right? There's no journalists there. There's no regulators there. And as one former forum executive put it to me, this is the place where the most powerful people in the world go to write the rules for the rest of us. But again, not in this sort of puppeteer conspiracy. What I'm writing about is more like, it's like climate change, right? Like no one really cares about fractions of millimeter movements in water. Suddenly we get a storm system and everybody's underwater and there's refugees involved, and then we care. And the pandemic has been that. It has been that storm that has exposed what's been going on for decades, with more and more people vulnerable because the wealth is dominated by a handful of people.
Yeah, let's do that first. And then I want to get into sort of the, at least the purported ideology of Davos Man, right? Let's talk about how Davos Man did under the pandemic. And you focus in your book on 5 individuals who are fairly important and well-known and probably the most powerful people in the world, or certainly among them. Talk about how, Jeff Bezos, Jamie Dimon, Schwartzman, all these guys did over the last 2 years. And what does that have to do with Davos and the World Economic Forum?
Well, they all did fabulously well. And they did fabulously well because they're very good at business, and they put themselves in positions where profits tend to appreciate when there's a crisis. They can make money in good times. They can make money in bad times. I mean, take somebody like Mark Benioff, the CEO of Salesforce, the Silicon Valley tech company. So here's a company that makes software that allows people to work from home. The pandemic is like fertilizer for that business. So his net worth is now beyond $10 billion. Meanwhile, you asked, what's the connection to Davos? Well, Davos is this place where the billionaire class gathers under the mantra committed to improving the state of the world, which is this extraordinary claim, given that these are the ultimate beneficiaries of the status quo. And at Davos last year, it was a virtual Davos because the pandemic made it impossible to meet in person. Benioff actually said out loud multiple times, CEOs are the real heroes of the pandemic. I mean, he wasn't talking about frontline medical workers or essential workers delivering our food or our Amazon packages. CEOs. And he said, this was because they produced COVID vaccines, they delivered finance that staved off bankruptcy. And he specifically said, the government did not save you. We saved you, not for profit, but to save the world. I don't think this is an accidental bit of phrasing. Some people have described this as a gaffe. This is not a gaffe. This is a worldview. And it's a worldview that encapsulates Benioff doing really well as a CEO of a company that's prospering, and at the same time protecting himself from people using their democracies to demand progressive taxation. I mean, Salesforce is a company that a couple of times has paid the modest sum of $0 in federal taxes on billions of dollars in profits. The Benioff is actually a complicated character. He's a member of the World Economic Forum Board of Trustees. He's written books about stakeholder capitalism. He's written books about how companies are supposed to do well and do good at the same time. He loves this origin story, how he started Salesforce when he took a sabbatical to southern India when he was plagued by existential doubts, and he met a woman called the Hugging Saint. She embraced him in an incense-filled room and whispered in his ear that he was supposed to go out and make a huge amount of money and then give it back to society. And, he has, to his credit, set up a company where 1% of the revenues and 1% of the staff time devoted to philanthropy. He loves to tell the story of how during the pandemic, he pulled his strings with associates in China, located 50 million pieces of PPE. We're talking face masks, hand sanitizers, medical gowns, gloves, and delivered them to frontline medical workers across the U.S. Hey, that's great. Probably saved lives. But also worth asking, why are we dependent upon a Silicon Valley tech bro to save us in the midst of the worst pandemic in a century in what's supposed to be the wealthiest country on earth? So all of that is of a piece of, I'm the good guy. I'm saving you. By the way, you don't need to force me to pay taxes or regulate my company because I can take care of everything.
Benioff is a huge figure here in the Bay Area, San Francisco Bay Area. The Salesforce office building sort of dominates downtown San Francisco now.
Right.
And he's known as a big progressive, big progressive. He gives a lot of money to progressive causes and progressive candidates. He funded Hillary Clinton's campaign and others, I think. So the thing is, when I found out that I didn't even know what Salesforce did until this all came down. But when I found out that Salesforce does software that allows for remote work, right? I thought, wow, the lockdown, really great thing for this guy. It's also a great thing for Jeff Bezos, another character, main character in your book, right? Obviously, people know that because of Amazon delivering things to people's doors, right? So the lockdowns, I mean, a lot of people on the conspiracy theory side of this see the lockdowns as at least, if not part of a conspiracy, certainly benefiting Davos Man, the big capitalist, the guys you're talking about, right?
Yeah, I mean, again, I just don't have truck for the conspiracy theory. I mean, if you don't think the virus is real,
no, wait, we're not. No one's saying that. I mean, I'm just saying, just that it benefits that class of people that you've identified.
Yeah, of course it does.
Okay.
I mean, of course it does. I mean, Bezos has been a primary beneficiary of the lockdowns. There's no question about that. And let's give Bezos credit, right? Like this guy had a brilliant idea. He executed it to something close to perfection. And the result is an incredible e-commerce empire. He would have been rich in any scenario because people like to shop through Amazon. It's unbelievably convenient, and it's truly revolutionized a major part of life. But Bezos is a guy, classic Davos man. He's doing well while his warehouse workers are not doing well. And it's not merely that his warehouse workers are laboring in warehouses without protection during the first wave of the pandemic. He's doing especially well because his people are left in warehouses in an especially vulnerable state. And when they protest, when Christian Smalls, a guy I spent a lot of time with on my book, leads a labor uprising at Amazon's big warehouse in Staten Island, New York, he is fired for violating quarantine. He basically says, you can't have us here with all the managers doing their jobs somewhere else, presumably on Zoom in their homes, and have us in harm's way without giving us some basic protection and giving us some answers about how you're going to keep us safe. He's then fired for violating quarantine, which is an incredible irony, given that he really wants everyone to have a quarantine. But with paid sick leave, something that Amazon, not by accident, does not provide, because it's been lobbying against paid sick leave for years and years. Bezos then doubles down and delivers this public letter, Dear Amazonians. This comes out in the spring of 2020. Yes, it's true. He acknowledges even though Amazon's known as the everything store, we couldn't find PPE. We were short. And at the same time, he says, we thank our workers, our essential workers, for doing this heroic work of keeping other people's grandmothers safe. We've prioritized the shipment of the very things the workers don't have, things like hand sanitizers, PPE. We're prioritizing all that stuff. It turns out, first of all, they're deprioritizing anybody who's not shipping through Prime, which is their own end-to-end logistics network. So if you ship through UPS or FedEx and you don't use Amazon's own logistics network, there are actually delays in what you're shipping, even if it's PPE. He values his monopoly power above any reality to that duty. But moreover, Christian Smalls tells me that's just total nonsense. Like he and his colleagues can see what's going into boxes. He says, it's jars of peanut butter, it's video game consoles, it's sex toys, it's like all the stuff that Americans are trying to kill time with while they're stuck in lockdown. And then after Christian Smalls is fired and becomes a media sensation, the general counsel of Amazon has a meeting with Bezos present. Vice News gets the scoop on the notes, and so we know this account, and Amazon has confirmed it. The general counsel, this guy Frank Zapolsky, who suggests, well, let's just put the attention on this guy Christian Smalls. Christian Smalls is an African-American guy from Newark who describes to me having worked in warehouses his entire life, where it's white managers who, as you put it in one place, treated us like we're out in the fields picking cotton. It's not a surprise that most of the managers at Amazon are white. Many of the employees are people of color. And now here's the general counsel of Amazon, now that they're dealing with a real corporate PR disaster. And he suggests to Bezos, let's train the spotlight on Smalls because he's, quote, not smart or articulate. And to the extent to which we can associate him with the movement, we will benefit. When this breaks, I press Amazon for some explanation, and the corporate PR people refuse to give me an interview with Sapolsky. They refuse to give me an interview with Bezos. And they do say, Mr. Sapolsky regrets his comments, and he did not know of Mr. Smalls' race when he made those comments. By the way, side note, Sapolsky on his Facebook feed has a picture of John Lewis and expressing his condolences when John Lewis passes.
So you're suggesting that Bezos and company may not care about people quite as much as they say they do?
I mean, it is what it is, right? I mean, Bezos is a guy who embraces this idea that he's part of this heroic struggle that is delivering human progress, and e-commerce is part of it, and give him his props. That is part of human progress. Yeah. But then he blasts himself into space in the middle of the pandemic to the tune of $5+ billion. This is money that could have paid for, who knows how much PPE, to say nothing of the COVID vaccines that most of humanity doesn't have. And then he thanks his warehouse workers for sending him into space as if we're all benefiting from it. This is classic trickle down. What benefit does the Amazon warehouse worker get out of knowing that the boss who hasn't given them paid sick leave or PPE is in space? I mean, this is like, and by the way, this didn't make it into the book because it happened just in the last couple of weeks. We now find out that Bezos, who has commissioned a $500 million, 417-foot yacht. This yacht is made near Rotterdam in the Netherlands, and it's so big that they're going to have to remove a bridge. And Bezos has apparently gotten the government in Holland to agree to remove and raise this bridge. I mean, presumably he'll pay for it, but in the middle of a pandemic, in the middle of a supply chain disruption, the likes of which no one can recall, Rotterdam, which is Europe's largest port, there are people in Rotterdam having meetings about how to move a bridge so that Jeff Bezos' pleasure craft can sail through. I mean, that's real Davos man behavior.
That's good stuff there. So here's the thing about Jeff Bezos. That facility, that Amazon facility where Christian Smalls was protesting the working conditions, Amazon received a huge amount of government subsidies and other breaks to build that facility there. And they did, I think, with almost all their facilities across the country and across the world. Huge government direct gifts often, or at least tax breaks. Right. Yeah. So if he has that boat and he has his rocket ship, I'm fine with it so long as he's not taking any of my money to pay for it, right? But he is, essentially, right? He's taking taxpayer money, isn't he?
Oh, without any question. I mean, Amazon vacuums up subsidies. It not by accident does it have 100+ lobbyists working in Washington, D.C., and it has lobbyists in every state house. The worst part is that this is a guy who essentially doesn't pay taxes the way the rest of us do. I mean, he's worth $200 billion. ProPublica reports that a lot of these tech billionaires who make incredible sums of money, and then it's all in the stock, right? So unless they sell the stock, there's no taxable event. And by the way, capital gains taxes, which would be payable when they do sell stock, are much lower rates than most of us have to pay on our income taxes. They don't even sell the stock to finance their spending. They get these incredible lines of credit, like a credit card that they never have to pay back until presumably they die. And they've got lobbyists working on, destroying what's left of estate taxes. So Bezos is a guy who on paper makes $83 billion a year. That's a salary from Amazon. That's about what a public school elementary teacher makes in California.
Wait a second. Wait. Say that again. You got the number wrong. 83 what?
83,000.
Thousand, yes. Yeah.
83. What did I say?
A million.
I say million? Oh,
yeah, I think so.
Yeah. No, that would be pretty good for a public school teacher. 83,000 a year.
Okay.
That's his salary. So that's what he's paying on taxes. I mean, the result of that is that people like Bezos and Benioff and Steve Schwartzman, another character in my book, private equity magnate worth $35 billion, they are paying a much smaller share of their income and wealth to the federal government than the people who are scrubbing their toilets. And that's a real problem. I mean, it's not just simply a question of fairness. It's a question of how does government function? And let's remember that Amazon can't function without the internet. That's a big piece of government infrastructure. It was developed through military spending.
That's right.
Amazon can't function without smart people to go work there and do the coding and run the logistics. People are coming out of publicly financed research institutions. It can't deliver all these packages without the highway network. That's right. That's taxpayer dollars. So, the whole thing breaks down if Davos Man can make these incredible fortunes on the back of publicly financed infrastructure and then not pay his fair share, to say nothing of the impact on democracy itself if huge numbers of people understand, and clearly they do, that their needs, their ability to pay their bills, to keep the lights on in their houses and support their families, just doesn't count for very much among the people running the system. That is where we're going to get conspiracy theories. That is where, people will come along aided by opportunists, both in media who are harvesting digital ad revenues from clicks. Political opportunists like Steve Bannon are going to come along and tell the story of the globalists meeting on top of the mountain at Davos to carve up the pie, leaving you out. And the lockdown is just a conspiracy, to send more money to Jeff Bezos or Bill Gates or whoever. I mean, we don't know what's going to happen when you leave tens of millions of people unable to support their families through the same hard work they've been doing. But we know it's not going to be good, and it's going to have some very destabilizing impacts. And we're not going to be able to have rational conversations about really important things like how do you deal with a pandemic, to say nothing of climate change.
For those of us considering moving out of the country, I have a great new podcast to recommend. Mikkel Thorup has spent more than 20 years living, traveling, and doing business in more than 100 countries all over the world. He's now the host of the Expat Money Show podcast, which is a complete guide to moving your life, your business, and your wealth offshore. By listening to the Expat Money Show, you'll learn how to live and do business in foreign countries and how to protect your money from government tax collectors. Mikkel will provide you with all the information you need to know about Plan B passports, legal tax mitigation, and asset protection. And right now, you can get a free special report just for unregistered listeners by going to expatmoneyshow.com/unregistered. Again, to get this free special report from Mikkel, go to expatmoneyshow.com/unregistered and check out his show. Thank you. So World Economic Forum, Klaus Schwab, and these guys talk about stakeholder capitalism. That's their term.
Right.
They're not always super clear about that. I mean, you talk about it quite a bit in the book. So you tell us, what do they mean by stakeholder capitalism?
Well, they mean different things depending upon the people doing the talking. But Klaus Schwab's been throwing this term around since the 1970s. He essentially just means public-private partnership.
Yes, right.
Benioff and Larry Fink, who's a key character in my book. I mean, Larry Fink is the world's largest asset manager. His company, BlackRock, manages $10 trillion worth of assets. This is, university endowments, pension funds from around the world. He and Benioff have been very vocal in arguing that this is the new age of stakeholder capitalism, by which they mean we're not just organizing our companies around maximizing profits, dividends that we can hand to shareholders. Milton Friedmanism is over. Now it's about being accountable to stakeholders. And what I've come to argue in the book is that this is just an elaborate way of protecting themselves. It's a prophylactic against progressive taxation, antitrust enforcement, and other efforts to equitably distribute the gains of capitalism. It's worth remembering that in the summer of 2019, this is the summer before the pandemic starts, the Business Roundtable, which is this lobby organization that represents the CEOs of the largest companies. At that point, it's headed by Jamie Dimon, another character in my book. He's the CEO of JP Morgan Chase, America's largest bank. They actually embrace stakeholder capitalism. They come out with this statement of a purpose of a corporation, this updated statement, and they get 183 CEOs to sign it. And it says, Milton Friedmanism is over. We're now catering to local communities, to workers, to the environment. Well, the pandemic is really the first big test of stakeholder capitalism. And we've already talked about Jeff Bezos. He signed the stakeholder capitalism pledge. So apparently either the pledge is not worth very much, or their version of stakeholder capitalism includes being able to fire the head of a labor uprising, a movement that's upset about the fact that workers don't have any protective gear in a pandemic and don't have paid sick leave. The Business Roundtable appoints a guy named Arne Sorensen, who passed away about a year ago. At that point, he was the CEO of Marriott, and he was heading a COVID-19 task force for the Business Roundtable. He got all kinds of props from the CEO class for the supposedly heroic video statement that he made announcing that 75% of Marriott workers in the U.S. were being furloughed. And a lot of them were at risk of losing their health insurance in the middle of a pandemic. And then he said, in solidarity, I'm going to give up my salary for the year. His salary was I think 1.3 million. Most of his 10 million plus compensation was in the form of stock. Didn't say anything about that part.
Sure.
And then just a few weeks later, Marriott goes ahead with handing out their next dividend payment to their shareholders to the tune of tens of millions of dollars, enough to have financed continued salaries for most of their workforce for many, many months. So, here is a classic example of the pledge not amounting to too much. Another signatory, by the way, of the Business Roundtable Statement of a Purpose of a Corporation, Albert Bourla, the CEO of Pfizer. So here's a company that we should be greatly appreciative that they gave us these vaccines. We should not be greatly appreciative that they promised to deliver doses to COVAX, this entity that's supposed to give us equitable distribution of vaccines around the globe. And they earmark some token, less than 1% of all the vaccines they're producing to COVAX. Meanwhile, they take this publicly financed research that produces the vaccines, and they sell their vaccine doses around the world to the highest bidder. And the result is if you live in a wealthy country like the US or the UK or Germany, it's very easy to get protection. Meanwhile, we still have a situation where frontline medical workers in parts of Africa, South Asia, Latin America are treating COVID patients without any protection. This is not only a humanitarian catastrophe. Again, it would seem to go against the stakeholder capitalism mantra. Right. It's also a disaster even for those of us in wealthy countries, because this is how we get Omicron. I mean, if we leave the bulk of humanity unprotected, we get these variants. And so the rest of us are subsidizing the monopoly profits of companies like Pfizer through our shuttered schools and disruptions to our kids' education, through lockdowns that are continuing to hit our livelihoods, through fear and death and the perpetuation of the pandemic.
To say that again, I'm sure I agree with you, but how does the fear help them? How does it help perpetuate the monopoly?
Well, I mean, as a result of not vaccinating the globe, we have variants. As a result of the variants, we have fear and death and disruption and continued threats to livelihood. And I'm not going to go conspiracy theory, but it also creates a market for more booster shots.
Gotcha. Okay,
that is part of the deal.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so stakeholders, they say, include their workers, but you just showed that probably it doesn't, at least in reality, right? Who else does?
Well, it does on their terms, right?
No.
It's all unilateral, right?
Right.
So it's never about collective bargaining. I mean, Larry Fink, who is really the leader of this movement, he puts out these letters to CEOs every year, and he gets a lot of acclaim from, I think, very credulous writers for driving the agenda toward solving climate change. He's going to push. I mean, BlackRock. Right. BlackRock controls 5%, at least 5% stakes in every company in the S&P 500. So Fink has essentially said, look, if you don't do right by climate change, fellow CEO, we're going to participate in depriving you of capital. Now, this has been a threat that he's never actually made. And when pushed, he says, no, I'm not talking about divestment. We're not going to divest from fossil fuel companies. Fossil fuel executives have to be at the table. They're smart. They know about climate change. Moreover, while Fink is saying stuff like this, he's a leading investor in Saudi Aramco, the Saudi national energy company. He's actually come up with $15 billion in capital to help them build another natural gas pipeline. BlackRock is one of the lead investors in JBS, a Brazilian meat conglomerate that's been clear cutting the Amazon to expand cattle production. So, he sort of talks out of both sides of his mouth on this. I focus in the book on the fact that in the middle of one of the worst waves of the pandemic, while Larry Fink is saying this is a great moment, not only for stakeholder capitalism, but for ESG, impact investments that are driven around environment and social aim. He says, especially the S, this is a great time for business to be an uplifting force for social concerns. He is personally turning the screws to Argentina in the middle of a pandemic because he credulously invested in the story of a kind of a fellow Davos man, Macri, the former president of Argentina, who was supposedly going to, make Argentine life, more friendly and conducive for people like Larry Fink. So Larry Fink comes in and invests, buys all these bonds, turns out to be a disaster. Now in the middle of the pandemic, Larry Fink is personally playing hardball as the head of one of the main consortium trying to collect on their bonds. And he's turning the screws to an Argentine government that's dealing with soaring poverty, extreme demands on its healthcare system. And he actually holds up a deal for a couple of pennies on a dollar because, as I put it in the book, nobody stiffs Davos Man. He understands that this is just the beginning of a series of debt workouts. This is at a time where, countries like Zambia, Ghana, Pakistan, they're actually cutting public health services in the middle of a pandemic because they're worried about prioritizing their debt payments to their foreign creditors. Fink understands that Argentina is just the first case, in many, and he wants to make it as painful as possible for Argentina so no other country thinks about stiffing Davos Man.
Right. Wow. Okay. Incredible story there. So stakeholders, according to them, in the stakeholder capitalism idea, who do they include? They
include everybody.
Well, really?
Yeah. No. At one point, Benioff goes on. One of my favorite moments in the book is in April of 2020. Mark Benioff goes on Jim Cramer's show. They have a real sort of bromance, Benioff and Cramer. And Cramer is practically beside himself with delight that Benioff has pledged no layoffs in the first 90 days of the pandemic. The next day, by the way, the 90 days is up, and Benioff quietly fires 1,000 Salesforce workers. That doesn't come up on the Cramer show. And Benioff, is going on about how he's going to plant 50 million trees, and Salesforce is now included in the Dow Jones. It's knocked aside a fossil fuel company, and Cramer is almost having a seizure, with delight. It's like, Mark, you could do good and do well at the same time. And Benioff says it's a great moment for stakeholder capitalism. And Cramer says, yeah, you're planting these 50 million trees. And Benioff says, Jim, the planet is a stakeholder.
Oh, okay. The trees.
How broad do you want to get? Is the whole solar system a stakeholder?
Well, but when they talk about it at least in their documents, at least the WWF, they talk about workers and they talk about journalists, maybe, I don't know, but they certainly talk about governments, right? Governments.
They definitely don't talk about journalists.
No, I take that back.
Yeah, we're not stakeholders.
No, they definitely talk about governments, though, right? Governments are one of the stakeholders, aren't they?
Local community, yes. Governments are stakeholders, yes.
Which right. and they work with governments. Everything you just
stakeholders, but stakeholderism is not a partnership. Klaus Schwab talks about it that way. It's always unilateral. It's always like, we're good. So Milton Friedman said we should just screw everybody because that could be good for shareholders. We're not doing that. We're going to be nice to everybody on our terms. We're not going to submit. We're not here submitting to increased tax collection or enforcement of existing tax rules. We're not for, reenacting antitrust enforcement mechanisms. And we're not for collective bargaining. They never talk about any of those things. It's always like, yes, here are some crumbs for you, stakeholders. If you're a stakeholder, you are by definition not that important. There's always a special stakeholder, the shareholder.
No, but they love some very important government institutions like the World Bank, like the IMF, like the European Union, don't they? The United Nations and NATO?
No. I would not say that. I mean, if you're talking about the World Economic Forum,
Yeah.
No, I wouldn't even go that far. I mean, yes, they like to put out big research papers, and they will collaborate with other institutions. But no, Schwab is not running around, waving the flag for the IMF and the World Bank or even the European Union, though he is a fan of European integration.
Yeah. Well, I thought they were defending the European Union against Brexit.
I mean, by and large, as I argue in the book, Davos Man doesn't like Brexit because, especially the finance people, because they see it as. I mean, Davos Man likes to deal with one regulator, right? So, like, if you've got a global bank that's got a branch headquartered in London, and you can serve all of Europe from that operation in London, and not have to have separate brokerages, deal with separate financial regulators and the 27 other members of the European Union, that's far to your advantage. You don't want to have to go figure out like who's really important in Estonia and what sports team do they root for, and how can I help their kid get an internship somewhere so we can be good with our Estonia business. You would rather concentrate that in one place. But I mean, I would push back on the idea that it's part of some sort of master view. I mean, what I have come to see time and again about Davos Man doesn't really believe in anything in terms of institutions, models, ideology. Davos Man believes in what's good for Davos Man, and the narrative will change based on whatever the conditions happen to be. If there's a crisis and it's a good time to get public money moving to bail out parts of Davos Man's portfolios in trouble, the Davos Man's for that. If Davos Man has got a monopolistic grip on the market and wins without any interference, the Davos Man's for rugged individualism and free markets. If Davos Man has an eye toward opening up some new market like China, when China entered the WTO, the Davos Man is for free trade. And if Davos Man needs to protect his own company against foreign competition, then Davos Man is for a level playing field, which could mean government interference. I mean, Davos Man is for whatever he needs to be for to keep the bottom line served.
So there's Davos Man, or I guess Davos Men, right? We've been talking about 5 in particular, men, right? And there's others too, but then there's WEF. I mean, I began this interview by saying the book is more about the people, I think, than, and their nefarious ways than it is about this institution, the WEF, and the ideology of it in particular. I mean, am I right? You don't actually mention the Great Reset in the book?
In passing, I don't spend a lot of time on the Great Reset.
And I don't think you've talked about Schwab's book, The Fourth Industrial Revolution, either.
I have not talked about Schwab's book, The Fourth Industrial Revolution.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's what I meant when I said at the beginning, it's about the people more than the institution. So, I mean, I'm curious about the ideology, again, of the WEF, like their ideology, which they've been stating since the early 1970s, Schwab and others too. And then he brings in these big capitalist guys to fund the thing, right?
Right.
And then they may or may not imbibe that worldview from Schwab. Who knows, right? But
Schwab doesn't live according to his own credo. I mean,
okay.
So yeah, Schwab's talked about the Fourth Industrial Revolution. Schwab's a big fan of European integration. He's a big fan of multilateralism and international cooperation. He's supposedly a big fan of the Paris Climate Agreement.
Right.
Yeah, that's all fine. But then, I can get Xi Jinping to come and give a keynote speech. Now I'm for Xi Jinping's great leadership of the Chinese people. And thank you, Chinese people, for sending us your great leader. Schwab welcomes Donald Trump, who is fashioning himself as a wrecking ball pointed at the liberal world order, which supposedly Schwab and his organization, by your accounting, represent. And Schwab practically embraces Trump on stage, thanks him for building a more inclusive America, and then says, we know that your leadership is the subject of misunderstandings and false interpretations, so it's so great that we can hear from you directly. I mean, the people I talk to who know Schwab say Schwab is a fan of power. I mean, he is Davos Man. Schwab understands that all of the stuff that you're focused on, that's like the that's window dressing. Schwab is running a business. It's a nonprofit on paper. It is a business. And the brilliance of his business is that he gets the richest, most powerful people to show up year after year. And they come because they know that the richest, most powerful people are showing up. So it's an incredible networking operation. I mean, that's what Davos really is. It's a networking operation. If he can get Xi Jinping to show up, then he can get senior members of the Chinese Communist Party to show up, which is a great opportunity for people like Steve Schwartzman and Larry Fink, who are doing huge amounts of business with the CCP and are courting Chinese investment into their ventures around the world. I mean, that's the value proposition. So I would caution you, not to fall for this idea that there's this ideology that these guys are driving, because they deviate from it themselves constantly. The only thing that's a constant is Schwab's maintenance of his centrality to an organization that is giving huge companies a reason to keep writing checks for hundreds of thousands of dollars a year.
Okay. I would say that they're at least, though, have always been committed to this partnership thing among themselves, among elite capitalists and government entities. I mean, Davos is always full of government officials, many heads of state, in fact, go there, right?
That's right.
I mean, so the government, and in fact, when you go to the United States government on its website, it lists the World Economic Forum as an institution to reference, in regard to foreign policy and trade policy. So I guess I mean, Schwab and company have been doing this stuff since the early 70s, almost as long as I've been alive. And there's been some consistency. They have consistently called for this partnership among the elites. They actually use that term sort of unselfconsciously, right? Which includes government officials, but it's big capitalists and government officials. So what I'm saying is that looks to me like what used to be called, and still is called, corporatism on a global scale, right? Corporatism, the merger or the alliance of big business and government to co-manage the economy. I mean, that's that basic model. I mean, model.
But if your premise is that the forum is this, secret club that's dedicated to this kind of corporatism and that's their agenda, then they failed, right? I mean, we've now lived through Brexit. Marine Le Pen is on the march in France. Trump was elected and may get elected again. Yeah. We've just come through a pandemic with very little multilateral cooperation. Very little coordination, such that, we have no public health coordination. So the pandemic is, COVAX didn't work. COVAX comes out of Gavi, which is this alliance that was actually forged at the World Economic Forum that was supposed to be about guaranteeing vaccine equity.
Stand and deliver, honey.
I've been looking all over for Uncle Tom, and here you are under my nose.
That nigga wanted the honey. All we want is the money. You dig it, baby?
If you read the forum's own reports, therefore expanded social safety nets, progressive taxation, all sorts of things that actually haven't happened. So I guess I think the proper way to look at Schwab is a guy who, will tell you about his agenda, but it always takes a backseat to continuing to have powerful people show. Where does Steve Schwartzman fit into Klaus Schwab's world, right? Steve Schwartzman's a guy who he's the world's most successful private equity magnate. He vacuums up foreclosed homes in the U.S. in the wake of the great financial crisis, spins it as this act of civic virtue, like tells you in his memoir that it wasn't about the money, it was about rescuing, whole communities that had fallen into disrepair and abandonment. He then invests heavily in healthcare in the run-up to the pandemic. He's part of a wave of corporate investment into healthcare that eliminates huge numbers of hospital rooms, not just in the U.S., but in places like Italy, in places like France and the UK, even Sweden. And as a result of this, we have a much deeper pandemic, and we have fewer resources to fight it. And Schwartzman finances Donald Trump right up until the bitter end. Until January 6th, he's still talking about, he's even supporting Trump's right to mount a challenge and to claim that the election was stolen from him. And it's not until it's not until Trump is, at least for the moment, a spent force that Schwartzman finally condemns January 6th, although then he puts the onus on the mob itself and not on Trump. I mean, so where does he, I mean, he's a very significant figure in Davos. He goes religiously. Where does he fit into Klaus Schwab's worldview? Presumably they're totally colliding. Schwartzman's not playing by Klaus Schwab's playbook, but the tent is big enough because the tent will include anybody who pays the freight to show up at Davos.
I mean, I have to imagine that Schwab kissed Trump's ass simply because Trump was the president of the United States at that point, and Schwab knew that he couldn't do much if he had the United States against him. I guess I just want to go about this corporatism thing.
Sure.
So to me and to many people, like the major response to the pandemic, the lockdowns, the vaccines, and the pushing of the vaccines, right? That was one of the largest corporatist enterprises in world history, right? I mean, you have big pharma with its monopoly protection, protected by government, by the way, working directly with governments around the world, and doing all the things that we know about, right? And the lockdowns, as we said earlier, right? That was maybe not deliberate corporatism, but it ended up being that because it benefited Amazon and Target and Walmart, and it killed the mom and pop stores who were competing with them, right? So it was very much always big government, big business collaboration, seems to me, in the last 2 years that brought us all the lockdown policies, all the COVID policies.
It didn't have to go that way, and it didn't go that way in every country, right? I mean, in much of Europe, you had very ambitious furlough schemes that protected huge numbers of people's jobs and protected small businesses. I would caution you not to, turn the American experience into the global experience. And I also, I just don't buy the idea that somehow the lockdowns represented this conspiracy from big business to put small business out of business, though that is certainly what has happened. I mean, there is no question that companies like Salesforce and Amazon and JP Morgan Chase, come out strengthened. Blackstone's now in a position to buy up distressed assets. That is definitely what has happened. But that's happened not because, the pandemic is this great opportunity to lock everybody down for nefarious means. I mean, personally, I think we've seen again and again, like there is no economic recovery until you get a handle on the pandemic. And you couldn't get a handle on the pandemic without lockdowns at different periods of time. And not every country bought that. Britain, where I was living when I was writing this book, was very reluctant to do real lockdowns, and then they did them piecemeal. There was never vaccine mandates. Sweden basically never did any lockdowns at all, and as a result of that, they got roughly the same economic damage as their neighbors, and a lot more death. And then they got lionized around the world as somehow, people like Tucker Carlson held them up as like a model of freedom. I mean, they got much higher death rates than Denmark, than Norway, than Finland, and yet they got basically the same level of economic hit during the first months because this was a global pullback. So I don't think we can point at the fact that companies like Amazon have benefited from the lockdowns, as they surely have, and say that somehow that was the driver of the lockdowns. And there were ways to protect far more people than we did in the U.S.
No, I didn't say it was a conspiracy. I said it was effectively a corporatist project, in that big corporations promoted the lockdowns, and they benefited from it, and the government went along with that. But the vaccine is just classic corporatist, right? Project. The biggest, worst corporations ever that everybody hates, and at the time it was the Trump administration joining together to do whatever they wanted, totally undemocratically, right? That's, to me, it's the model, the corporatist model, which of course the roots are in fascism. That's corporatism is the basis of fascism. So to me, that's the real problem here, is that model.
I think you're making an interesting argument. It's making me think back to what Benioff said about how, the CEOs are the heroes. I think it does go to your point. Yeah. I do think that stakeholder capitalism comes out of I mean, I think it's mostly a bunch of PR puffery,
Mm.
but it comes out of a certain tradition in which we are invited to see business as the solution to our problems. But I mean, that model has failed, worse than it ever has before. I mean, it's been revealed as entirely hollow. If we're depending upon big corporations to spare us from the pandemic, well, hello, Delta, Omicron, whatever letter comes next in the Greek alphabet.
Right.
I mean, business is ultimately going to cater to its shareholders. And by the way, I mean, my point in critiquing stakeholder capitalism isn't to say, hey, Benioff and Fink and the rest of these guys, they actually ought to be serving our interests far more than they are. No, I think we just need to dismiss, this fairy tale and let them cater to shareholders while we impose rules on them that ensure that the public has a say about who pays taxes, where the returns go, what conditions, workers can count on. And then meanwhile, have real partnership known as democracy, where we use the government to solve problems that we can't count on the market to solve.
Right. Okay, good. Getting to the nub of it here. So regulations, you say that these people, Davos Man, is generally not interested in regulations, but he is interested in regulations of a particular kind, is he not? I mean, they call for extensive regulations concerning climate change, extensive regulations concerning automation, I think, and they want the government heavily involved in reshaping the economy around their vision of a world in which we work at home, and there are no emissions, carbon emissions. No, I mean, are they not calling for massive regulations in that way, at least?
Well, I mean, I think you're doing a favor to Larry Fink when you make that argument, right? I mean, Larry Fink is now being attacked from the right for supposedly running, woke capitalism, right? I mean, the state of Texas just put out this resolution threatening to not do business with BlackRock. I mean, they've got a lot of pension funds managed by BlackRock. If BlackRock follows through, they say, on this implicit threat to divest from fossil fuel companies, Larry Fink is having it both ways. Larry Fink is not using shareholder votes to actually change. I mean, if Larry Fink were truly for this corporatist vision of climate change, we'd probably have a lot more movement to attack climate change than we actually do. I mean, where's the cap and trade system? I mean, where are the rules limiting emissions in a very strict way? All of this stuff that these guys are talking about is mostly voluntary. It's mostly about trust us and we'll take care of this. And what we see again and again is that if you look at what they're actually doing, I mean, Larry Fink went to Davos in the desert, which is this World Economic Forum-like event, hosted by the Saudi government, only months after the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, the Saudi journalist employed by the Washington Post. Larry Fink would love us to believe that he's part of this, conspiracy to deal with climate change, because what he really wants is essentially the status quo. I mean, when he's honest, he says, well, in truth, I'm actually just a fiduciary. 75% of the money I manage, it's in things like index funds, exchange traded funds, where it's essentially automatic. If you buy the S&P 500, you own little shares of the 500 companies that comprise the S&P 500. And so what he's saying is, that's most of my business. So I don't really even have the power to tell these companies what to do. I'd like you to think I do when I write these, letters from atop the mountaintop, from the mountaintop on my letters to CEOs every year. And Larry Fink would like to be applauded for the flexibility that's allowing, companies to have employees work from home. He wants credit, sort of across the spectrum. I just don't think we see anything coherent enough to justify a belief in a framework that all these guys buy into.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's fair what you're saying. Yeah, it's ad hoc. It's not part of a grand plan. I think I agree with you that they are megalomaniacs and have with savior complexes. Max Weber's whole thesis about the great robber barons was that they had this belief that they were going to be the world's saviors or the world's father. That's why Carnegie gave all this money to libraries and museums to uplift the poor, right? I think it's the same impulse. Do you see that in these guys?
Yeah, I definitely do. There is definitely a savior complex. And when Benioff runs around, talking about how CEOs are the heroes, we see that. Fink has said that, one benefit to the pandemic is that it's reinforced that stakeholder capitalism is the future, which again, puts the onus on, to your thesis, corporate power to solve our problems. And I do think that they believe their own narratives, and that being the savior makes it harder to justify taxing them.
Right.
I think it's usually about taxes.
Totally. Yeah. So in my view, and I think you agree with this, they've at least used government, right, for their various projects. They've at least partnered in some places. Yeah, maybe not in some, according to some grand plan, but they certainly have, right, in many ways.
Sure.
So now you're saying
just follow the money, right?
Totally agree. Yeah. So now you're saying instead of that funky relationship, that structure that nobody likes, by the way, who likes Davos? Who likes the World Economic Forum? Who's their constituency?
Well, Benioff loves it.
No, I know, but I mean, besides the people
who misses it,
besides the people who are actually in it, right? There's no constituency. The right,
a bunch of glad-handing access journalists really enjoy it.
Yeah.
I mean, it's their chance to go hang out with the star CEOs, to feel that they're a part of history.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, you would have a better feel. I mean, unfortunately, I've been there 9 times, so you'd have a better feel for this than I. I mean, my wife will not let me carry around my World Economic Forum tote bag. It's so embarrassing.
It is indeed. Yeah. All right. So you want to replace that system, which no one likes except for the people who are part of it, with a system that you're calling one of rules. And so what are the rules you want on these people?
I mean, I want something pretty simple, actually. Mm-hmm. It's simple in description. It's real hard to execute. And that's to go back to something we've already had, which is progressive taxation, antitrust enforcement, and rules that allow labor to organize. And if we had those 3 things, we would solve a lot of problems. We had that from 1945 to 1975. That was pretty much the world we lived in. I don't have a fetish for that time. I don't want a time machine back to the 1970s. We made an enormous amount of social progress that we ought to hang on to. I mean, right. We had Jim Crow in that period. Sure. We had the Vietnam War. We had all sorts of disasters. Sexism was far worse than it is now. So we don't need to go backwards, but we do need to return to a time when working people can count on getting a commensurate share of the productivity gains through wages, not through, thank you, Davos Man, for your largesse when times are good, or, there's a current labor shortage. Suddenly everybody has to pay more for truck drivers or nurses or whatever, but through actual power, right, through a collective bargaining process where workers have a say over their pay.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So if we do that, if we reinvent the labor movement and eliminate the laws, Taft-Hartley, I'm sure you're talking about, right? All the laws that were made it more difficult to organize. Why are you convinced that the labor unions, the newly powerful labor unions, will do the right things with their power? I mean, labor unions have had a very very mixed history. I mean, they've done really good things in some cases and really horrible racist things and sexist things and all sorts of stuff, right? Yeah, I mean, and
I don't think there are magic solutions to any of our problems. And I mean, if you're getting into things like racism and sexism, I mean, we need representation throughout every part of our society. I mean, there's no single bullet to any of these like deeply entrenched systemic problems.
My bad. More relevant. They could easily go protectionist. They could easily go Trump MAGA on this. They could easily go nationalist populist on this, on politics in general. Right? Could. Many unions are protectionists, right?
For sure. But, I'll tell you something. I mean, years ago, I went to a mine in Sweden and I visited with a bunch of workers there at a time when automation was threatening a bunch of jobs. They were going to bring in self-driving cars to replace the trucking fleet. Mm-hmm. And I was astonished. I talked to all these employees there and all of them said, yeah, we're fine with it. This doesn't trouble us at all because we know that anything that makes our company more competitive will increase our wages. And they even said, maybe this will cost me my job, but then I'll be trained for some other job. This was not some crazy faith. This was based on lived experience because in Sweden, like all of the Nordics, labor represents something like 70% of the workforce. And everyone understands that the unions sit down opposite employers' association representatives and they hash out wage scales that must reflect productivity gains being given to the workforce in the form of wages. That's something these guys knew. they understood that this was the system that they were reared in. Whereas, look at a coal miner in America, where we say, hey, sorry, coal miner, you're going to have to give up your sustenance and your way of life because you're doing something that's now backwards. That's part of the problem. So you need to go and train to become a solar panel installer. Well, that coal miner has every right to say, come again? What can I see that gives me any indication that anyone's going to help me if I have to move somewhere? Where am I going to get trained? My family's not going to have health insurance. If I lose my job, we don't have anything approximating national health care. And so, in the labor context, somebody, a steel worker, here's a union, for instance, the Steelworkers Union, that has been protectionist, that has been opposed to automation, because their attitude is any change is malevolent. Like, we don't, if we give up anything, we don't get anything. If we give up something so that our company becomes more competitive, so they can now, buy some component from Canada, so that they can push down on wages or replace some worker with a piece of equipment, that's just a net loss. We're not getting anything out of the deal. And the only people who will benefit are the executives and other shareholders. So I'm not saying that, what you're saying is a real problem, but it's a problem that's rooted in a context. Writ large, the only solution to the divisions that we've got in American life involve giving more people a stake in a society in which most people have figured out they don't have any stake. Their needs don't count for anything. So they're susceptible to whoever's peddling, some story that exempts the real people who are responsible, so they'll fall prey to Bannon and Peter Navarro and Donald Trump, saying that, China has stolen our way of life. Gordon Chang, this crackpot, who's written this book, came out 20 years ago, The Coming Collapse of China, still keeps flacking it. Look, the problems, China is a real problem. China is a serious problem in terms of the global trading system that we're going to have to deal with other countries. But the idea that the steel worker in America is suffering simply because of China, that may be the latest thing that happened. It's a whole series of problems and the responsibility lies with, decisions made in boardrooms in New York, in Seattle, in Congress, in multiple presidential administrations on both sides of the aisle. So unless we restore a sense of opportunity, yes, you're right. The labor unions will just, protect whatever they got and they'll go nationalist and they'll fall victim to cheap narratives. All
right. Well, it sounds like that you, so you talk about the Swedish model there, there is, Sweden has a model in which, as you described it, labor works with, co-manages the industries, the economy really, with business owners and the government. That is a form of corporatism also. It's what we call social democracy, that form. And it's a social democracy that is very favored among people in the United States who are on the left or liberals, right? Because it provides very generous social welfare to the people, et cetera, right? But the basic model, the structure is the same as the corporatism of Davos Man. It's just that Davos Man's corporatism does stuff that you guys don't like, and a lot of us don't like. It's just, does that make sense that the ideas
I see your point.
Okay.
But I think you're missing a key element, which is the democracy part.
Okay. Yes.
There's less money in politics.
Yeah.
There's more transparency. People actually have a vote.
Gotcha.
And the labor union represents a democratic outcome. So if people have decided, we're going to entrust, large companies to handle. And by the way, I'm a capitalist, right? I think the market system works incredibly well in terms of delivering innovation, in terms of giving us transparency on prices, but it needs to be a market that's regulated by somebody who prevents manipulation by bad actors. And in many of the supposed markets in the US, what we have is a form of monopoly power that's masquerading. It's a kind of corporate welfare system for big, well-connected companies that can hire lobbyists and rugged individualism for everybody else. But this back to the Nordic model.
Yeah.
If that's what the people want, that's what the people should have. The problem is that in the US, excuse me, I mean, what we have is a system that is manipulated across the board by, dark money, where we don't know who's financing campaigns, where there's organized disinformation through social media. This, by the way, has happened in Sweden too. I'm not trying to let Sweden off the hook, but I don't have a problem with a corporatist solution per se, if there's an actual democratic process and there are uninterested independent regulators who are keeping an eye on fair rules of the road.
Okay, fair enough. A more democratic economy you're calling for.
Yeah, sure.
And I take it you see sort of the New Deal model as a relatively democratic economy.
I mean, the New Deal's a complicated period. It was a long time ago. Don't necessarily translate to today. But look, the idea that there should be an expanded social safety net, if we want to call that the New Deal, sure. I mean, how many laid off coal miners actually could go do something else,
right,
if we had health insurance?
Right.
How many people would quit crappy jobs, in warehouses for Amazon and start their own business if they weren't worried that losing their job was a pathway to sleeping under a highway overpass somewhere? I mean, a social safety net actually makes us more entrepreneurial.
I agree. You favor the UBI, don't you? Universal Basic Income.
I think the UBI is an interesting idea. I'm not sure I would say I favor it.
We have a chapter. You have a chapter on it, but it's
I have a chapter
sort of
on
favorable.
It, I mean, it's favorable. I think the idea of some kind of mechanism that takes away the worry about homelessness and lack of healthcare is really important, and that could be UBI. The problem is, like, who's proposing it? I mean, Benioff loves UBI. Silicon Valley loves UBI because it's a sort of like, oh, okay, we're threatening all your jobs with robots, but here's 10 grand a year. Are we good now? Is everything cool? Moreover, a lot of libertarians have favored UBI because it's a way to justify eradicating other parts of the social safety net. And I think if that's what we do, that's a disaster. I mean, if you strip away what healthcare exists, what unemployment benefits and housing exists, and everybody gets, some minimal check, I think that's a real problem. If UBI is part of a more expansive social safety net where, we take the edge off of, I mean, the Swedes will tell you, like, we don't protect jobs, we protect workers. Yeah. We need a system like that. If UBI is part of that, fine. The problem is UBI is most easily done in a beneficial way in countries that already provide really expansive social safety nets. So like in Finland, where they trialed it, I went and saw the trial a couple years ago in Finland when they launched it in 2016, or actually I wrote about the preparation for the trial. They spend so much on social safety nets that they can rationally say, well, instead of, an unemployment system where we discourage people from getting jobs because their unemployment benefits are so generous and people are at risk of losing them if they take a job on the side, let's replace that with something like UBI so there's more flexibility. Yeah, hey, that's a net benefit because they're already spending the money. It's just a question of how they're spending it. In the US, I mean, before the pandemic, you would have said that any kind of UBI was the equivalent of like the federal government agreeing to hand out a unicorn to every American. Right. I mean, the costs are so high. So probably the way politics works in the US, Davos Man supports UBI as a means of getting out from under some other kind of spending. Okay. So, it ends up being a zero sum, and then UBI becomes destructive. Right. But it's potentially a very positive mechanism. Okay. Sure. It depends on the purpose of it. Right. Correct. Yeah, I gotcha. Okay. Well, good. This has been great. I've learned a lot. You've made me think through this, what Davos means to me. I really, the vigor with which you did this was tremendous. And thank you. Thank you for writing the book. Thank you for coming on the show. Thanks for the provocative questions. I enjoyed the back and forth. Thanks for reading the book. Good. Absolutely. My pleasure. Thank you, Peter. Good luck. Thanks so much. Okay. Bye-bye. All right. Take care. Bye. This is the Unregistered podcast, and I'm Thaddeus Russell. To join the new Renegade University, go to renegadeuniversity.com. To join the new Unregistered Underground, the supporting listeners group for the podcast, go to unregisteredunderground.com. Thanks for listening.